Welcome, everybody. We are getting underway. We are not going to be doing Parshat Vayikra this week. We are going to be talking about Purim because by next week it's going to be a little too late. So we're getting in the Purim spirit. So we are going to be talking about one of the great mysteries of the Megillah, right? One of the great problems, questions that people ask, or people perhaps don't ask enough because people just sort of take many aspects of the Megillah for granted. But, right, if you think about the Megillah, what is the core event that sets everything in motion, right? So if you were to give, the story of the Megillah in a couple of sentences, it would basically be, there's a guy named Haman who wants to, who's angry at this Jew named Mordechai for not bowing to him, so he decides to kill the Jews, and turns out that Haman's niece Esther is the queen, unbeknownst to anybody, and Haman is ultimately betrayed or stopped by the combination of Mordechai and Esther conspiring to have this intricate plot where the king Ahasuerus turns against Haman, and indeed, instead of Mordechai being executed and the Jews being harmed, it is Haman who is executed and the enemies of the Jews who are harmed. And
Mordechai's niece.
Sorry?
Mordechai's niece, not Haman's.
Yes, Mordechai's niece. Did I say Haman's niece?
Yeah.
Oh, all right, beautiful. We're Yotzei already. That didn't take long.
Yeah,
exactly. We're Yotzei already. Actually,
Is she a cousin or niece?
Yeah.
Esther, is she Mordechai's cousin or niece?
Niece.
It's contagious.
It's defined? Okay.
Yes. But do.
Some stories
So-
for kids call her a cousin.
Well, there's the exact nature of the relationship we will leave aside for the moment. That gets messier as we go along. But the question is, what sets all this in motion, right? What sets all this in motion is Mordechai doesn't bow down, right? So let's look at what the Megillah has to say about it. Source
Wait a
one.
minute.
I think
I don't know that that's...
Well, let's start by reading it inside. Doctor, you can read it. Go ahead, source one.
Fine. I thought Mordechai doesn't bow down, but I thought he also mentioned that they kept to themselves. They are...
Well, let's see what the Megillah has to say.
After these things, this is Esther 3:1-7. After these things, did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the officers that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed down and prostrated themselves before Haman, for the kings had so commanded concerning him. But Mordechai did not bow down or prostrate himself before him. Then the king's servants that were in the king's gate said to Mordechai, "Why do you transgress the king's commandment?" Now it came to pass, when they spoke daily unto him, and he did not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or prostrate himself before him, then Haman was full of wrath. But it seemed contemptible in his eyes to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had made known to him the people of Mordecai. So Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, for they were the people of Mordecai.
Okay, so
a little anger problem.
Yes, and we'll touch back on that at the end, I think. But right now, so what's our question? Okay, Haman is furious at Mordechai for not bowing down. Why is everybody else bowing down?
Because the
king commanded it. So the question is, why isn't Mordechai bowing down? Now, the answer that some people just sort of instinctively give is that Jews can't bow down. You're not allowed to bow down.
He had a statue. That's the other story.
Well, hang on a second. We'll get there in a second.
Image of a statue or something.
Are Jews allowed to bow down?
But you can bow down to a king or a ruler out of
Right.
respect.
So not only are you let it.
What's the big deal?
Right. So you see that in Tanakh all the time. Like nowadays, we're not really accustomed to do it because we don't live in that sort of a culture. But Abraham bows down to Bnei Chet, and Yaakov bows down to Esav, and in the rest of Nach we see numerous instances of people bowing down. They prostrate themselves to the floor. Right? Why? Is there a culture that you can think of today where people bow down regularly?
Japan.
understand, right? Why do people bow down?
Respect.
Out of
It's a sign of
respect.
respect, right? When if it's two equals, they sort of bow down equally, and if one is a social inferior and one is a social superior, what happens? The superior gives sort of a very preliminary type of bow, and the social inferior gives a much lower, deeper, longer bow. And how low your bow is and how long you bow, all this has to do is very complex social issues. But at the end of the day, right, it's a sign of respect. And there doesn't seem to be anything stopping all sorts of other people in Tanakh from doing it. So why isn't Mordechai doing it? So the answer isn't, well, he wasn't, you're not allowed to bow down to a person if you're a Jew in Tanakh. That can't be the answer. So what else have we got in the Megillah itself before we go to outside sources? In the Megillah itself, well, no, doesn't
Nothing's
say.
in the
Doesn't say.
Doesn't say.
So what answer do Chazal say? Right, the classic answer Chazal give. Now there's a number of answers that midrashically that go all over the place. Some in remarkable areas, going all the way back to personal history between Mordechai and Haman from the wars and from this and from that. Okay, but standard answer.
Do you have
He
an image
must
of
have had an
Amalek on
idol
there or
on him.
something like that?
So potentially some sort of larger political issues. Okay, but again, standard.
The idol.
There's something to do with that. Okay, so source 2, right? This is from Esther Rabbah.
Okay, can we back up for a second?
Well, let's read source 2 and then we can back up. Source 2, sure.
Rav Pinchas said, "What did Haman do? He took a graven image and sewed it into his clothing over his heart, such that anyone who bowed to Haman was worshiping idolatry."
Okay, we're going to go there in a second. But wanted to take a step back first, George? Yes.
Number 6, but it seemed contemptible in his eyes to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, so Haman sought to destroy all. That doesn't make sense to me. Does it make sense to you? What?
So look, we can certainly get back to that. I think on a very basic level, and there certainly may be a lot more going on there, especially if you go into there's history, etc. Although the text does seem to, belie the sort of idea that they had a previous relationship, because it seems like they told him about Mordechai and who Mordechai's people were, and then he was angry at the people, and if they had some sort of long past, presumably he would have known all that. But
The plot thickens because he had a plan. They have money, they have riches, they have things. There's another plan ahead.
possibly, it doesn't seem like that's a major element, right? It does. You can argue that it
in the king's
is.
eyes. Gets favor in
Right,
the
right,
king's
but it
eyes.
seems like he's paying huge sums of money, and who is paying who sums of money to who, and being paid to who, is a little bit unclear from the gut, and we're not going to be getting into that today. But generally speaking, it seems like Haman feels like he has been publicly wronged, and if he were to just punish the person who publicly wronged him, then that would be insufficient. So he wants to make a much grander gesture of it. And we're not going to explore it right now in this second. In about 1 minute, we're going to get back to that idea, because where does this come from? I think when we think about it, we'll see exactly where it comes from. Because, right? Oh no, go ahead.
No, I never really noticed that it said because the king had commanded it.
So it's very interesting. It says because the king. It's what they translate. It says because kichem siva lo hamelach. Now the word lo is
Love.
very, very, very important and vague, because it can mean one of two things. It can mean because it was so commanded by the king concerning him, which means our omniscient narrator is telling us that the king has issued a decree, presumably with all the formalities, etc., that you have to bow down before Haman, and Mordechai is disregarding this. The alternative is Kichein Siva Lo Hamelach, means the king commanded it to Haman. In other words, Haman is going around saying, the king says that you all have to bow down to me. Well, now the source for this isn't our omniscient narrator. Now the source for this is Haman, who is a little less reliable than an omniscient narrator. It's an interesting point, and you can certainly do a very interesting read. I think Rabbi Foreman actually does a very interesting read of the Gemara based on this idea of Kichein Siva Lo Hamelach, where basically the gist of it, and it's a very, very fascinating and complex analysis, but a significant point in there is basically he sees Haman as trying to arrange a coup against the king and trying to have grandeur on himself sort of in the place of the king, and what he's doing is taking advantage of the fact that there's a bottleneck. You can't just see the king. There's a title for people who can see the king, and they're called, in the Megillah, they're called Roe Pnei Hamelach, because most people aren't allowed to see the king. If you're allowed to see the face of the king, you have a special title. Haman knows that your regular person isn't going to be able to successfully challenge him. And so when Mordechai is challenging him, Haman realizes, right, he needs to take grand action to stop him, because what Mordechai is really doing is undermining Haman's authority, saying, I don't believe you. I don't think the king actually commanded it. I think you're having nefarious plots against the king. How do we know Mordechai is the kind of guy who sniffs out nefarious plots against the king?
Because he did.
Because he did sniff out nefarious plots against the king, right? Big time terrorists try to kill the king, and it doesn't work out. Okay, because of Mordechai, right? Mordechai stops them. All right, but putting that aside for the moment, right? What do we have? We have, and the Gemara in Megillah also says it relates to idolatry. Haman declared himself to be a god. Here we have this piece in Esther Rabbah saying he sewed the idol into his clothing. Now, why is it that the medrash is assuming it's idolatry, right? You have numerous sources saying it must be Mordechai didn't bow down to Haman because of idolatry. Why?
Because there's no other logical reason.
Exactly, right. What's the punishment for disregarding the king's decree? Death, right? Now, what don't you do as a Jew? What are you not allowed to do when the punishment is death? Well, there's three things you give up your life for, which are idolatry, adultery, and
Conversion or no?
murder, right?
Murder.
Now, refusing to bow down before Haman, is that murder?
No.
Refusing to bow down, is that adultery?
No.
So what's left?
Idolatry.
It has to be idolatry. There's nothing that's left, right?
Is it really adultery? I heard it was illicit sexual acts.
Okay, fine. We certainly don't need to go down that path. It's very, very complicated. But the main issue here is, right, that's what it has to be, right? How else could Mordechai justify risking his life? Not only his life, but the life of all the Jewish people. Yes?
Well, isn't it implied by the Esther Rabbah that Haman was really provoking Mordechai by sewing?
Well, actually, I was going to say the exact opposite. That seems very weird, after all, right? This isn't right, a Jewish monarchy where if somebody's going to worship idols, they need to sneak it around. It's Persia. If Haman wanted to wear an idol, what could he do? Wear an idol. Why on earth wouldn't he just wear an idol? It's this weird situation where Haman has taken this very strange and surreptitious route of sewing an idol inside his clothing that somehow Mordechai has found out about. Now we know Haman isn't particularly concerned with Mordechai prior to this point, because Mordechai isn't bowing down to Haman, and Haman doesn't know or care. It's only when people come to Haman and say, hey, Mordechai the Jew isn't bowing down to you, and he starts noticing it, then he gets really angry. So he's not doing this in order to provoke Mordechai.
Public embarrassment.
So why is he doing it at all?
Why
So,
are they
But this is a
going
fiction.
to
You're
Haman
arguing a
and telling
fiction.
him this?
I wouldn't say we're arguing a fiction, right? We're arguing the medrash. What's our rule about medrash? Medrash is always based in text, right? It's always based in text and context. And in this case, the context is obvious. We're trying to figure out why Mordechai doesn't bow, but we have this strange language of of Haman sewing this idol into his clothing over his heart. Very strange.
But it could be some sort of a kameh. I don't know how you say it in English, like an omen, like something
Good luck
to,
on
like it's a
Talisman or okay,
Right.
maybe, but we don't really sort of see that in other places. I don't think.
Like a
I think I'm missing a
talisman?
point. Was it visible to everybody, or was it?
Presumably it was visible to nobody. It doesn't explain how Mordechai knew about it at all. It just says somehow Mordechai knew it. It doesn't say
Okay.
anybody would know about it.
He wasn't walking around like some people wear a cross around their neck.
Exactly. It wasn't that sort of a situation at all.
Then I have a theory.
It
Oh.
says clothing over his heart.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a theory?
presumably-
That-
Visible.
The Persians were Zoroastrians. I mean, they had a very limited religion. They weren't like the.
So we don't really know what Haman's deal is, because Haman is an Agagite. So what does that mean in terms of his religion? What does that do?
That's my point. Maybe it was something not Zoroastrian.
It could be. It could be. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. We have a different question, another question that bothers us, which is, if this is our motivation, right? This is what gets the story going. What's our problem? Where are these psukim? They're chapter 3.
I'm sorry, were all these
These psukim are in chapter 3. But if this is where the story starts going, why do we need chapters 1 and 2? Right? Now, it is important to know that there's Mordechai and Esther, and that Esther marries the king. That's certainly very important. How many verses would it take to relay this information? One, right? There's Mordechai and Esther. Esther was kidnapped, was married to the king, and she didn't relate to the king, her true relationship, or her people. Boom, right? After this, the king went and promoted Haman. So what do we have in the first two chapters? We have a very long, detailed description of the house that the king lived in, the palace of the king. We learn all about this elaborate party that he throws, and we learn about the whole Vashti story. Now, Vashti disappears in the second parak and never comes back again, but we have this whole elaborate Vashti story. Then the king regrets it, and we have this whole elaborate sort of reality TV type, The Bachelor type story where the women are coming and they're being in oils for this month, for this this long, and they're being in the scents for that long, and they're coming before him, and they're going and they're gathering, and they're. Why? Why do we need any of this information?
We're setting the stage.
Okay, but it's two prakim worth of setting the stage, right? There's, I think it's Rabbi H. Shalom who has a line who goes like, as every single 8-year-old knows, the first two chapters of Megillah Esther contain like 50,000 million psukim, because they're sitting there with your grogger, waiting for Haman, and no, it's the king, and it's Vashti, and it's Mordechai, and there's more spices. Where's Haman? Right, we're waiting for. So theater is all fine and good, but do we really need 8 psukim describing the king's palace? Do we? So what's going on? So there's two things that are, I think, very significant that are going on. The first of which is, we have this intricate description of the king's palace. Well, it's very interesting. An intricate description of the king's palace. It's interesting. What's the layout of the king's palace? Well,
very similar to the temple.
Exactly. You have an outer courtyard, right? Outer area where people can go. Then you have an inner courtyard where only the ministers of the king can go. And then you have the innermost sanctum where the king is, and only the special. And what happens if you dare come into that place when you're not allowed to be there? You get killed, right? There's a direct parallel between that and the description of the Beit HaMikdash. Not only that, we're told it's made out of gold and tachelet and all these other things that are obviously, we just finished reading, Vayakal Pekude. These are directly related things. We have very significant descriptions about the clothing, and they have to wear this clothing and this and that, etc., etc. What everybody's wearing is very significant. What people aren't wearing is very significant, right? What's going on? We're drawing a parallel between the two. Why? To say, what's going on with the Jews of Shushan? They should be worshiping at the house of God. Only instead of the house of God, they're at the house of Achashverosh. And they've replaced the Beit HaMikdash with the palace of Achashverosh. And they have replaced the Melech Malchei HaMlachim with Achashverosh himself. Meaning, they've taken an omnipotent and an omniscient and a powerful and a merciful God, and replaced him with a drunk fool, right, who can't even control his own kingdom and doesn't even know what's going on with his own ministers. And they've replaced the temple of God with this place of drunken debauchery. Why is that significant? Well, if Achashverosh is taking the place of God in this perverted, bizarre universe, right? And if the temple if the palace is taking the place of the Beit HaMikdash, so we have our bizarro, Beit HaMikdash, and we have our bizarro king. So we need to have a bizarro Kohen Gadol. Who's our bizarro Kohen Gadol? Haman is our bizarro Kohen Gadol. And what do we know about the Kohen Gadol? What do we wear? Source 3.
The Kohen Gadol?
Yeah.
Bizarre.
Right, exactly, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Source 3.
And they shall bind the breastplate by its rings to the rings of the ephod with a thread of blue, that it may be upon the skillfully woven band of the ephod. And the breastplate shall not separated from the ephod.
It shall be not separated. I actually made that a double negative by mistake. I apologize.
Okay.
Right? The choshen and the ephod may not be separated. What the ephod exactly looked like, we don't know. There's different theories. The choshen is the breastplate. And what do we know about the breastplate?
shall bear the names of the children of Israel in the breastplate of judgment upon his heart.
Oh.
When he goes in unto the holy place as a memorial before the Lord continually.
Okay, so what do you have? This special cloth, the special clothing, the ephod. Attached to the ephod is the choshen. The choshen is of a divine is a divine object. It's a divine vessel that's made for direct communication with God. It is worn over the heart. The one may not be separated. They have to be directly connected. And it is worn when he goes before God. So, if we're going to have our Bizarro Kohen Gadol, we have to have our Bizarro Choshen Ve'ephod, says the medrash. So, says the medrash, what is Haman doing? He's positioning himself in this, Bizarro backwards Beis HaMikdash as being the Bizarro backwards Kohen Gadol, right? And so he's wearing his idolatrous Choshen Ve'ephod.
Wow.
Okay, so now we have something of a better idea of why we have the whole description. But what else, right? We have this whole Vashti story. Why do we need the whole Vashti story?
Because there has to be a
Well,
reason
what happened? But you don't need that information. All you need, if we only knew the king married Esther, and that's all it says, right? None of that, you could say it would even be better that way. Because if all we knew was the king kidnapped Esther and married her against the wishes of her family, or without the knowledge of her family, and she didn't relate her true relationship with Mordechai, what story is there a direct parallel with that otherwise we have to do very circumventing and circuitous connections with? Oh, there's 127 provinces. Oh, 127. That tells us about who's 127 in the Torah? That's the age of Sarah. What do we know about Sarah?
Oh, in Egypt.
They go to Egypt. What happens? She gets kidnapped. She gets brought in front of the king.
She's the sister.
And what does she say about her relationship? Oh, she doesn't tell the truth about her relationship with Abraham, right? And there's clearly parallels between that story and the Megillah, right? Not telling the true relationship until it's revealed, and the hand of God being involved, etc., etc.
I think.
But it gets more convoluted because you get lost in all these side stories and all these other things going on. You can lose track of that. Rabbi Akiva has to come and say, "Look, 127. Ooh, right?" But this way would be much cleaner. So why do we need all these other stories?
It also happened with Yitzchak and.
Yes. Now that's a different situation where. When it comes to where there isn't the kidnapping, but they lie about the nature of their relationship. Okay, fair enough. But right, what's going on here is we have these other stories, right? We have this Vashti story. Now, what's going on with the Vashti story? The king is having this big party. He tells Vashti to show up near the end of the party wearing royal garments. And Vashti says,
I thought just the crown
No.
on her head.
so it says she should wear the Keter Malchut. So the medrash says, oh, of course, what does that mean? Okay, fine. Again, midrashically, it's a beautiful idea. But on the level of shot, he's saying, okay, come wearing, in your royal garb, presumably. All I'm saying is, I've definitely had situations where, my wife has said, oh, company's here, come down wearing the shirt that I bought you. I assume she doesn't mean. Right? Okay. So what's going on is, Vashti is supposed to appear. And she says no. And so what happens, there's a huge thing, oh no, what are we going to do? And they consult with the historians to see what do you do, and the people who maintain the protocols, what's the protocol? And nobody knows, such a thing has never happened before, where the queen refuses a public request, demand of the king in front of everybody. So what happens? This guy Memuchan says, what are we going to do? Well, look, you can't just punish Vashti, right? Because it's not just about Vashti. If you make this just about Vashti, then it's a petty squabble, and you look weak. Rather, what do you have to do? This is about all women everywhere, everyone who's in Vashti's group, everyone who's like Vashti. You have to say, we're making an example of Vashti and all of her kind. So we're going to put out a decree everywhere, in every language, in every city, in every kingdom, in every part of the kingdom, in all the 127 provinces that say the men are in charge and the women have to listen to their husbands.
She's been idolized as the
No,
first
why-
feminist and all that. And
Why? Well, hang on a
I
second.
was,
Well,
I was in a
we're-
group
Just
once that
like-
wanted to rename the Book of Esther the Book of Vashti. I thought it was ridiculous.
so we're going to get back to that idea.
I'm sorry, what was
We're
that?
going to get back to that idea, right? What role does Vashti play in all this? But what do we see? Vashti doesn't like what the king has ordered, refuses to do what the king has done, what the king has commanded. As a result, there's a decree not just against her, but against all of her kind.
Okay, so that's a parallel then.
Exactly! What happens? The king commands everyone to bow to Haman. Mordechai says no. What occurs? There's a decree not just against Mordechai, but against all of his kind. Right? What we're doing is we're figuring out what the pattern is in the story, right? And we would expect that what happens to Vashti is the same thing that's going to happen to Mordechai. Now, what happened to Vashti, we actually don't know. It doesn't say explicitly.
No, it doesn't.
There's very dark and ominous rumblings.
She disappears suddenly.
Exactly, right? But
Wait a minute, people are talking and I
oh,
don't
okay.
understand.
We don't know exactly what happened to Vashti, but it certainly seems pretty dark and ominous. But, right, at the end of the day, it seems clear that we have this parallel going on. Yoni Grossman goes into much greater detail about this, about the nature of what's going on with Mordechai, the nature of what's going on with Vashti. So, we have our main question here of why is it that Mordechai doesn't bow down? We still don't know. So we're going to put that aside for a second, like good Jews, and we're going to ask some more questions. We're going to take a different approach from the approach we often take, and I'm going to ask a very strange question. Well, that's actually a pretty normal approach for us, but I'm going to ask a practical, hands-on question, bearing in mind that for all halachic practical questions, the answer is ask your local rabbi. Baruch Hashem, right? Our community is blessed with many rabbis who are very happy to provide their time and opinions on these critical, practical matters. But we're going to be having this hypothetical situation. Friend calls you up and says, I've tried every rabbi in town, I can't get through to anybody, and you are the most Jewishly oriented person I know, so you need to help me out here. Here's the situation. As you know, I'm getting on a bit, the hip ain't as good as it used to be. I am not going to be able to make it to synagogue for Purim night reading the Megillah, right, breaking the fast, reading the Megillah. But I made arrangements, and they're going to send someone over to my house to read the Megillah when they're done in the synagogue. But the problem is, the fast ends at, say, 7:30. They're going to start Megillah reading in the synagogue at 8. They'll be done around 9. The guy will get to my house around 9:30. They'll finish it at 10. I can't fast until 10 o'clock. It's too late. It's too late for me to be fasting. What should I do? What would you tell them?
Drink a milkshake.
I would say break the fast.
When do you break the fast?
When the rest of the community does.
After the
Wait a
story
minute,
about
so
Vashti.
breaking,
Well, that'll take me about 10 minutes. I'm not sure that helps.
the question is, you can't, my question, you can't eat until you've heard the Megillah? Is that how it goes?
So, I'm providing you with all the information you have at this point, right? The fast ends, let's say, 7:30. The Megillah reading in the community is going to be at, say, 8 o'clock. It'll be done around 8:30. But at their house, because of the situation, right, the Baal Koreh has to get there, etc., all that. The Baal Koreh won't get there till 9:30. Won't be done till around 10. And they said, look, I can't make it that long. So what do you advise them to do?
If the fast is over,
The fast-
then it's over.
The fast is over at 7:30. Like, it was whatever. What do you mean? The fast is over at 7:30. So you eat at 7:30, and when the guy comes with the Megillah, so you read the
But
Megillah. Then.
isn't it officially Purim at a certain time? You're not allowed to fast.
Right. It's Purim. You're not allowed to fast for the entire day. It doesn't mean you can't go 5 minutes without eating.
Yeah, but Purim
But-
starts in the evening, so
Purim starts in the evening, but still, right? You
You can
know,
fast on Purim.
you can't fast for all of Purim, but that doesn't mean you can't go a little bit of time.
An hour with.
You can go an hour without eating. That's okay. I mean, I understand if you have, a nice Jewish mother, you can't go for an hour without eating. But that's a Kibbutz Avayim issue, less than a Purim issue. So, okay, it's pretty straightforward, right? It's pretty straightforward, right? When the fast ends, you break the fast, and then you wait for the person to come read the Megillah, and then you hear the Megillah. Okay, what is it?
What's the big deal?
What's the big deal? So, just to confirm, let's read the Shulchan Aruch, source 4.
One who is an honest,
Someone who's an honest ktsat.
in some discomfort but not serious danger, and cannot go to synagogue, and therefore must wait until after the congregation reads, because then someone will be sent to their home to read the Megillah, and it is difficult for them to remain fasting for that long a time. It is permitted for them to hear the Megillah read while it is still daytime, from Plag HaMincha, 1¼ hours before sunset.
That's like halachic hours, although this time of year, halachic hours and regular secular hours are pretty similar.
And later, and then it is permitted for them to eat if the fast is difficult for them.
So what does the Shulchan Aruch say?
So
No problem. Just have someone come over to your house and read the Megillah earlier, and then break the fast then. No problem.
That is a problem.
Yes, that is a problem. What on earth is going on here? You're reading the Megillah when it's not Purim. You're breaking your fast when it's... What on earth is going on? Why wouldn't you just say, right, if it's basically like the world's easiest multiple choice question, right? What should you do? Should you, A, wait until the fast is over and then read the Megillah at its proper time, or B, read the Megillah at the wrong time and then break your fast early? What are you talking about, right? Obviously the answer is A, and yet the Shulchan Aruch says the answer is B. Now, I do want to point out, the Mishnah Brura and a lot of the Achronim don't paskin this way, and if the situation or anything related comes up, of course you should ask a rabbi. But, right, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't, it's not a misprint. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't pull it out of a hat. There's a number of Rishonim who hold this way. So, why?
So
Right?
according to this, then you have to hear the text before you eat.
Yes, according to this, the most important principle we're trying to preserve is reading the Megillah before you break your fast. And if you've got to do that on the 13th, fine, do it on the 13th. It is better to do that than to break your fast when the fast ends, and then wait a couple of hours and hear the Megillah afterwards. Wow.
because you might forget to read them, to hear them.
So that classic answer, right? Beautiful. Classic answer that we say for many things, which is you're not supposed to eat before you do certain time-bound mitzvot because you might forget to do them, right? It's a classic thing. You don't eat before Shacharit, and you're not supposed to eat before you light Hanukkah candles, lots of things. Slight problem, right? Are there any ways of getting around that? There's two main ways of getting around it. The first of which is
If you're sick.
you can appoint a reminder. You can say, okay, Bob, your job is to remind me to light Hanukkah candles. Your job is to remind me to, so I don't forget to do this thing. And then it's fine, right? Because you're not going to forget. Second thing you can do is also, generally, if you have a snack, it's basically fine. Again, I'm not posketing anything. If there's questions, you should a rabbi, but there's numerous sources that say, right, especially if you're not going to have mezonot, especially if you're not going to have hamotzi, you're going to have a snack. Okay, so have a snack. So you should tell this person, appoint a reminder. If you can avoid having a huge meal, don't have a huge meal, just have a snack, and then you won't forget to read the Megillah. Plus, they're sending the guy over to your house. It's not even like you could forget. The guy's coming to you. So you already have your reminder there. The reminder is going to be the knock on the door. So, what on earth is going on here? Very strange. So, what is the deal with reading the Megillah on the 13th? So actually, there are some sources for this. Let's look at source 5, starting with the Gemara.
Reb Shmuel Bar Yitzhak said, we know the Megillah may be read on 13th because the 13th is the time of assembly for all and does not require special inclusion from the verse.
Okay, so the Mishnah actually says there are times when you read the Megillah on the 11th or the 12th even, and it brings special verses in order to prove that. And then they say, oh, well, if you're going to use the verses for this, then, how can you prove the 13th? And Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak says, the 13th you don't need a pasuk for. Right? You don't need some special learning. You don't need it's not if you get stuck in one of the outer villages. And forget about that. The 13th is a day of assembly. Therefore, everyone agrees it's obvious that, of course, you can read the Megillah on the 13th.
Is the 13th a date, and is it all?
It's the day before Purim.
Every year, every month?
Every year. Every year.
But in general, it's not read until after dark.
Right. So after dark is the 14th. So what's going on? So it's a day of what on earth does that mean? It's a day of assembly.
That's when
So
they were
who's
getting
assembling?
ready when they were getting ready to arm.
Oh, so let's read what Rashi has to say. Source 6.
at time of assembly for all gather to gain vengeance against their enemies, whether in Shushan or in the other places, as is written in the book, the Megillah. Therefore, no special inclusion from a verse is needed to show that reading the Megillah is appropriate on that day, because that is when the essence of the miracle occurred.
Okay, so what happened? Everyone gathered in order to fight the big war.
Right.
Therefore, it's a day of gathering. Therefore, we're all good, right? It's a day of gathering. That's good enough for the Megillah.
Wait, what big war is this?
What big war was fought in the Megillah?
When they were
Purim, right? Yes, no, absolutely. Purim was a big war. We forget about that, right? We're busy designing our costumes and figuring out whether we're gonna do a zoo themed Shalach Manas or a baseball themed Shalach Manas, right? There was a war.
That war.
Yeah, that war. Yeah, which is really very appropriate, right, as Americans, because like what's Memorial Day, right? Oh, it's the barbecue day. It's when we have 30%. No, it's a Memorial Day. We should remember there were wars. People died. People gave their lives. People were injured. We should take the time to appropriately commemorate them and remember their service. Remember what it is they gave. But no, we're much more interested in hot dogs and hamburgers. Much more important.
It's also mattress sales.
So what does that mean, inclusion? There's no special inclusion.
In other words, you
from a
don't
verse.
need it. It's called you don't. No, in this case, it's a form of exegesis. It's basically saying you don't need a special verse to come and include this date, because you wouldn't have known this date. You wouldn't have known you're allowed to do this except there's a special verse or there's a special. We learn it out from this verse. No, you don't need that. It's a day of assembly. Good enough. That's what Rashi says. Rabbeinu Tam says something different. Now, this is Rabbeinu Tam as quoted in the Rush, not usually when you speak Rabbeinu Tam, you expect to see it in Tosfot. This isn't in the Tosfot on the side. This is a summary. This is not verbatim what he says. This is a summary of his opinion. But what does Rabbeinu Tam say?
Okay. The source of Ta'anit Esther is not from the Megillah, but rather from the reference in the Gemara to the 15th being a day of gathering. This refers to when they gather now, not when they gathered then.
Oh, that's different.
So everyone comes to the towns for the special prayers and slichos. And so we can see by the war with Amalek, where Moshe, Aaron, and Hur went to the mountaintop, meaning to declare a fast. From there, Rabbeinu Tam finds a slight support for the Ta'anit Esther that we do.
So, what does Rabbeinu Tam say? No, what does it mean they gathered? Not in ancient times they gather. We gather now, right? Why do we gather now? Oh, Tanis Esther, right? It's a big Tanis. So, of course, people are going to gather. We have special reading of the Torah, and we have this, we have that. What's the problem? Well, Tanis Esther, of course, right? The fast of Esther, of course, right? Where in the Megillah does it talk about Tanis Esther?
It doesn't.
It doesn't. Okay.
Well, she says.
Well,
No.
It mentioned briefly that Esther fasted for 3 days.
When it says that
requested that
everybody else fast
before she goes before the king.
And when does she go before the king? Pesach, right? It's Nisan, right? That's not Ta'anit Esther. The way we talk about Ta'anit Esther.
We're only doing it in sort of a remembrance of that.
So at no point does Esther say, and everybody should remember to fast, right? I want this day commemorated, this Purim day commemorated for all eternity. And of course, you should also commemorate the fact that we fasted by fasting the day before, because that would be a little bit incongruous. It doesn't appear anywhere in the Megillah. So okay, fine, we've got Mishnayot, right? The oral law. So the Mishnayot tell us what's the source for Ta'anit Esther. There's no Mishnah about it. All right, we've got Gemara, right? Thousands and thousands of pages of Gemara, right? So, we got a whole Masechus Megillah. So, what portion of Masechus Megillah talks about Ta'anit Esther? Yeah, you're looking at it, right? Rabbeinu Tam says, it says a day of gathering. Oh, what must the day of gathering be? That's the source for Ta'anit Esther. Wow, right? Now, and he says, because what must it be? Before you have a war, you fast. Now, the source that he brings is one from the Torah of the Battle of Amalek, because it says Moshe, Aaron, and Hur, and from there, the Gemara learns out that you need 3 rabbis to declare a fast, and they were declaring a fast because it was a time of trouble. Okay, you see in other places, right, Shaul declares a fast when they're going to go battle the Plishtim. It's definitely a thing, right? It's a pretty counterintuitive thing, but it is a thing.
Right.
Nonetheless, it's very strange, right? it seems like Tanit Esther is much later, right? There's no mention of it in the Tanakh. There's no mention of it in the Mishnah. There's no direct mention of it in the Gemara. The closest you get is, it says, a day of gathering. So what's going on, right? Why, why do we need to, what's this essence of a day of gathering, right? Per Rabbeinu Tam, where is this whole idea of Tanit Esther coming from? So, I think one more question and then we can get on our way. Everybody, of course, gathers together for reading the Megillah at night, right? The show is absolutely jam-packed. Men, women, children, costumes, fantastic. The Balkore is, on their finest voices, impersonations, the extended version with all the theatrics. And then the next day, you have a hungover because, of course, of the great commandment to drink at Purim at night, which is completely non-existent. Even the requirement to drink during the day is suspect. We'll deal with that at a different time. There's absolutely no basis whatsoever at all for drinking at night. Nonetheless, right, the next day you have 11 hungover guys. And, the only time anyone's wearing a costume is if you considered wearing last night's clothing to be a costume, right? And what happens, right? The Balkori is sitting there and runs through the Megillah, and there's I don't want to say it's a minhag Yisrael, but there's a pretty general consensus at this point. The first time and maybe the last time you say Haman, people bang, and that's it, because we want to get through it, because we've got a meal, and we've got Shalach Manas, and the kids, and all that stuff. So come on, let's go. What's the problem?
Because you're hungover.
So what? It should be the exact opposite. In other words, the main requirement is to read the Megillah during the day, but we have some later takanot to say we should do it at night too, and we're looking for a source for that. So what does the Gemara say? Suggests there's a source for it. Source 8.
Your turn. No, you're
Oh, Danny?
All right, then, no problem. You absolutely can pass, no problem.
Let's see.
Source
Eight.
Eight.
Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi further said, it is the duty of a man to read the Megillah in the evening and to repeat it in the day as it is written. Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not answer. And in the night season I am not silent. Silent. Rabbi Chelbo said in the name... Elbow.
It's like cello.
Like cello.
Of Helm.
Helm, yeah.
Like Chelmsford.
Yeah.
Rabbi Chelbo said in the name of Ula of Biri, it is a man's duty to recite the Megillah at night and to repeat it the next day as it says, to the end that my glory may sing praise to you and not be silent, O Lord my God, I will give thanks to thee forever.
Okay, now the second source is we give praise to God, we give thanks to God. In terms of the Megillah, does that make sense? Giving praise to God, giving thanks to God? It works pretty well, right? In fact, there's opinion in the Meiri that says, why is it that you don't say Hallel on Purim?
You don't say
Hallel on Purim? So, classic answer, it's not in Israel, okay, fine. But you don't say, one answer is, the Megillah is the Hallel, and to the point where the Meiri says, right, what does it mean the Megillah is the Hallel? If you don't have a Megillah, you actually say Hallel. Okay? Again, if the situation comes up, I strongly encourage everybody to ask the rabbi. But, right, the idea of the Megillah itself being praised, or these ideas being rampant in the Megillah, pretty straightforward. But what's our first opinion? Our first opinion is, I'm crying out in agony to God, right? And God doesn't answer, so I repeat my prayer, right? I'm seeking, right? Seems like a very strange...
But God is not mentioned at all in Megillah. God is not there.
It's true, right? You don't have... That is certainly true. So what is going on? So, there's an argument that's made, and the last number of sources, the last approach, is based on a shir that was given a few years back by Rabbi Asaf Bednarsh, who I believe himself was basing in a shir by the Rav, by Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal. And he says, right, at the end of the day, all of our questions can be answered by the fact that we don't properly understand what Purim and the Megillah are all about. How should we properly understand it? So let's read source 10.
Source 10?
Source 10. Yeah, I accidentally tried to switch source 9 for source 11 and just repeated itself. So source 10.
The prophets and the courts ordained and commanded that the Megillah be read at its appointed time in order to recall the praise of the Holy One, blessed be He, the salvation He wrought for us, and His response to our cries, so that we will bless Him, extol Him, and inform the future generations of the truth of the Torah's promise.
What is Purim fundamentally about, says the Rambam? Fundamentally, it's about calling out to God.
It's Yom Kippur.
In a way, it's Yom Kippur, and we're going to get back to that idea of Yom Kippur in a second. But it's about calling out to God. It's about extolling God. It's about begging God for mercy, etc., etc.
But we never mention God anywhere in the Megillah.
We don't mention God in the Megillah. There is a lot of crying out, but
and
it's true.
Esther repeats,
That's true.
my king, my
But
king.
what's going on, right? What's going on about the nature of the day, right? The nature of the day, says the Rambam, is it's about calling out to God, and yet it's not, right? Exclusively that, because what are the commandments of the day? The commandments of the day are all action, right? They're things you have to do. You have to read the Megillah, you have to have a meal, you have to give to the poor, and you have to send food, ish l'reyehu, one person to the next. What's going on fundamentally, I would argue, the nature of Purim is about the combination of crying out to God, of words and of deeds and of action. Right? You need to have both. It is not sufficient only to have one. So what's going on? Because the day is a day of the combination of the two, not simply enough to say, we went to war, not simply enough to say, we called out to God, but rather you need to have both. Right? This is a very ancient Jewish idea going all the way back to Yaakov, right? Yaakov has numerous confrontations in his life. Perhaps the most quoted one comes from his confrontation with Esav, where he calls out to God, but also he takes action. Right? He prepares evasive maneuvers. He prepares for a military confrontation. He also tries to avoid a military confrontation. Right? It's not, and of course there's prayer and supplication. It's not one or the other. It's both. So when you have that, now you can understand, right, our previous questions. You understand what's going on in terms of why is it that the source for reading the Megillah is I'm crying, or for reading the Megillah at night and the day, I'm crying out to God. Right? Why is crying out to God such an important source? Because that's a significant portion of the day. Right? It's not just about the things we do. It's also about prayer. It's also about supplication. We understand why it's so significant that you can read it on the 13th, because it's a day of gathering. What do you mean it's a day of gathering? A day of gathering means that's the essence of the day. And that's also why it's so important that you be fasting when you read the Megillah, to the point where you have the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch and the other Rishonim that the Shulchan Aruch is based on. Because what's going on? You're trying to, when you have the joy of the salvation, it's based on, it's not in a vacuum. It can't be in a vacuum. You need to understand where it comes from. And it comes from the pain that came from the fast and supplication to God. And if you separate the two, when you say, oh no, this here, that's our day of fasting and prayer. And this here, that's our day of action and warfare. And those are for those people and those are for those people. You've missed the point. One has to blend seamlessly into the other, to the point where the Shulchan Aruch says, even if you need to read it on the 13th, even if you need to break your fast early, it's fine as long as when you read the Megillah, when you have the experiential portion of the story, you're doing that where the rachamim, where the words, where the supplication blends seamlessly into the action. Now, moving back to our original question, and incidentally, by the way, right, we see this generally by when you have a day of sort of confrontation, a day where you're in judgment, you need to, a day where there's trouble, you fast before it. What's the thing, right? As a general rule, you're not allowed to fast on holidays, and you're also not allowed to fast the day before or after, right? Going back to Megillat Ta'anit, right? As a general rule, you're not allowed to do that.
But we fast on the day afterwards.
So, I'm sorry.
Wait a minute, I'm sorry.
Right, so we do under certain circumstances, and the question is why?
Can you repeat?
So the question was about Tzom Gedalia. Now, Tzom Gedalia is, interestingly, right, we treat Rosh Hashanah as Yom Arichta, etc., but the general idea is you're not allowed to fast the day before or after.
A holiday.
A holiday. What's going on, right? In theory, though, what you're supposed to be doing before a day of calling out, before a day when you're in trouble, when you're in judgment, is to have a fast. The main day when that occurs is Yom Kippur. So, of course, you're not going to fast the day before your fast. What do?
We eat a lot.
We eat a lot. Why do we eat a lot?
To prepare for...
Because eating a lot is considered a fast. Now, why it's considered a fast is an interesting question. Is it because it's the exact inverse? Is it because it will make the fast twice as difficult? Okay, that's an interesting question. But at the end of the day, there certainly is this notion that you're supposed to be fasting in a certain sense Erev Yom Kippur. What's going on, going back to our original question, is why doesn't Mordechai bow down? Let's take all of our elements and put them together and see what we get. Who is Mordechai? What is Mordechai in our scheme of things? Right? Mordechai is a representative of the Jewish people. And what does he do? Mordechai is the conscience of the Jewish people. He is the moral backbone of the Jewish people. When he sees wrong, when he sees evil, he opposes it. And how does he oppose it? With his words.
That's a Navi?
He always opposes it with his words. He sees people conspiring against the king. What does he do? He informs it, right. He informs the proper authorities. When he sees Haman the Agagite, right? Now, who is Haman the Agagite? He is the manifestation of Amalek, right? What does Haman represent?
Evil.
How so? What are his attributes? Anger, lust for power, narcissism, right?
Greed.
He is greed, absolutely. He is
Genocidal.
He is the personification of Amalek. So Mordechai must oppose him. So what happens when they say, bow down before Haman? What's Mordechai's response? No, he's not going to bow down. What's the problem? We know how the story ends. How do we know how the story ends? Because we've seen it before. From this viewpoint, you view Vashti in a very positive light. The king ordered Vashti to do something. She deemed it immoral, so she said no. What happened? She pays a significant price. The exact nature of the price we may not know, but she pays a significant price. So we're looking at this and we're saying, we know what's going to happen to Mordechai. And indeed, what happens? Haman is sitting there, gets the decree. All he needs to do is nothing. Right? That's what Haman needs to do. Nothing, and then everything he wants is going to come to fruition. He just needs to wait a few months. That's it. Not even a full year. Instead, he can't help himself. His anger, his narcissism get the best of him. And he goes before the king at an inappropriate time, and that's when his downfall begins. Ultimately, though, Mordechai is the man of words. That's what he does. He opposes via his language. How is he saved? Because what happens when Mordechai finds out about the decree? He puts on sackcloth and he speaks to Esther. And what does he say? Go to the king and beg the king. Speak to the king. That's all he says. Go speak to the king and beg him to save your people. Is that what Esther does?
No.
No.
Not right away.
Why? Because Esther is not the outsider. Esther is a court insider. She understands how it is that things work. And she's the woman of action. So what does she do? She puts into effect a fairly complex plan. She figures out how to catch the king when he's off guard, how to catch Haman when he's off guard, and how to turn the king against Haman, because she realizes that's the only way that this is going to work. She is simply the king's main squeeze, and not necessarily even the main squeeze at this point, because it's been 30 days and she hasn't been called. Haman is the trusted advisor. Haman says, I want to destroy all these people. The king doesn't even ask who the people are. The king just signs off on it. She can't go before the king and say, I'm one of those people who's going to be killed. Please ignore Haman and listen to me. She's going to get Vashti'd. She needs to figure out how to turn one against the other, and she has this plan she puts this plan into action. And then even after the plan goes into effect, everything goes off without a hitch. Right? What's Mordechai's response? Mordechai's response is, okay, now we need to have the decree annulled. But you can't have the decree annulled. So it's up to Esther. Esther falls on her knees and she begs, and the king says, okay, I'm going to give my ring to Mordechai, and you can do what? Use your words. Mordechai can put into words whatever he wants in the decree, and it'll get sent out to all the people, and all the people will defend themselves. So what's going on? Mordechai is the moral backbone, is the conscience. He's the one who says no in the face of evil. How does he not wind up like Vashti? Because of Esther. Esther is the woman of action, and she's the one who understands on the inside what needs to be done. It's all very fine and good to take a moral stance, but if you're beating your head against a brick wall, you're not doing any good. You need someone who can turn that moral stance into a plan of action. So what happens? What is it that ultimately betrays Haman? Remember, if Haman does nothing, then he's fine. But Haman can't do nothing. Something causes him to fly into a fit of rage. Now, he's walked out from the king Ahasuerus's palace, and he is joyous, and he is happy because he has gotten the king's agreement to completely destroy not only Mordechai, but all of Mordechai's people. This is the most glorious and glad day for him. And yet, because something causes him to fly into a rage, and because of that, he gathers his family, and he builds the tree, and he builds the gallows, and he runs in front of the king late at night, and that turns into the king happens to be reading his book, and then Mordechai is the one who gets rewarded, and Haman gets punished, and then the next day when he's supposed to be showing up for this banquet, the second banquet, he hasn't slept all night, he's had a terrible night, and then Esther drops this bombshell on him, and he jumps on the queen's couch, and the king looks at him and says, right? Are you going to try and conquer the queen even while I'm here? In other words, what's happened? The king finally realizes Haman is after his throne. Or at least, if not realizes, at least thinks that Haman is after his throne. And what does it say? Upnei Haman chafu. Right? They cover the face of Haman. Why do they cover the face of Haman?
Because he can't see the king.
He's no longer ro'ei pnei hamelech. Right? He's no longer allowed to see the face of the king. What caused all this? What set all this in motion? Haman was in a great mood at the pinnacle of his career. He's going to destroy utterly all of his enemies, and something causes him to fly into a rage. What is it? Our final source 11. George, I think we're up to you.
Then went Haman forth that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and he did not stand up or even move for him, Haman was filled with wrath against Mordecai.
He did not stand or move. Not he didn't bow down. Not he didn't prostrate himself. He didn't stand. He didn't even move. He refused to show Haman any form of respect whatsoever. This isn't an issue of bowing down in front of an idol. This is saying, I refuse to recognize your existence. Right? He's nullifying Haman, and that causes Haman to fly into a blind rage, which leads to Haman's ultimate destruction. Mordechai, as the man of words, not the person of action, is who he is because of his words, is endangered because of his words, and is saved because of his words. And who does he need in order for all that to happen? He needs Esther as the woman of action to make sure, behind the scenes, that everything takes place. How do we commemorate this? Right? We have our Tanit Esther. We have our fast where we cry out to God and use our words. And the next day, right, we have our Purim. Now, in ancient times, right, unfortunately, sometimes even today, the threat facing the Jewish people was an existential threat from the outside. Nowadays, what are the problems that we have? They're much more internal. They're social problems. They're problems, Yisraehu, Sinat Chinam, right? That's what destroyed the second medrash. So what's the action to save the Jewish people that we have on Purim? We send gifts one to another. We take care of the poor, right? Those are the actions that we do to save the Jewish people. And what's the bridge between the words and the action? It's the Megillah, which in and of itself is a bridge between words and action, right? It's the most active listening you're going to do, right? Active listening is a big thing. The Megillah is super duper active listening, especially when you're an 8-year-old. So what's going on? The fast is part of the experience. The fast is what allows the Megillah to be real. You understand even a tiny portion of the suffering, of the danger, because you haven't eaten anything in a long time, and you're also, right, you can understand Haman making poor decisions and being disoriented, because you're a little bit, obviously not the same exact way, tiny bit along that same vein. So we have a better understanding, I hope, at least one approach of what's going on with the Megillah, with Mordechai's motivation. I'm just going to end by perhaps extending it to one other place. Right? Where else do we see this idea of the experience being very important? So you make sure you go into it when you're very hungry? Pesach, exactly. What happens? Right? Chazal set up a situation on Pesach where, first of all, right, you don't eat before a mitzvah, so you're not eating for a while before. And even if you were going to eat, right, you're not allowed to have bread for almost the entire day, and you're not allowed to have matzah for at least the entire day, if not for significantly longer before. The point is, right, you're going to be hungry. When you go into the Seder, right, you know, it's the most common thing in Judaism, right? Oh, let's get through this, I'm so hungry, right? It's not an obstacle that was poorly thought out. The point of the Seder is you need to experience leaving Egypt. And what's part of the experience of leaving Egypt? You need to understand the suffering and the poverty, and you're supposed to understand the freedom and the riches, right? So what winds up happening, right? You're starving. What do you have in your stomach from the last, 5 hours? A cup of wine. And then all of a sudden, someone hands you like a piece of potato dipped in salt. Now, 9 times out of 10, or I would say even more than that, 363 days a year, 364 days a year if you live in Israel, if you're hungry and someone says, well, here's a piece of potato that I dipped in salt water, you would say, get the potato away from me, I want to have some food. But what happens on Pesach? That's the most delicious piece of potato you've ever had in your life, because you're really hungry. And you know there isn't going to be any more food until you finish all of Magid. So what goes on? Right, you feel a little bit of that experience of relief to know, right, obviously it's not the slavery in Egypt, but experientially your stomach is rumbling and you're hungry and you're a little bit distracted and you get that little piece of food and you feel that little sudden burst of energy, right? It helps experientially, it helps you understand a tiny bit what it would have been like. So hopefully, this upcoming Purim, we will have a better understanding of the Megillah, we'll have a better understanding of our own experience, leading all the way from the Megillah into the Zman of Geulah, into the time of Pesach. All right, with that, we'll go off the record.